This is Radio Caroline on 199, England's first commercial radio station.
As far ago as 1925, radio broadcasting was becoming very influential, and the government of the day realised that this was a dangerous thing to have in the hands of private companies and individuals. They prohibited anyone else being able to send radio signals, so the only people that could send radio signals were the British Broadcasting Corporation, which effectively was an arm of the government of the day. And as they had a monopoly, there was no need to ask the population what they'd like to hear. So the people running the corporation, who were chosen for their gravitas, said, well, we'll give the people what we want them to hear. And all the things that they felt the population wanted to have. But of course the population weren't consulted, and we didn't accept that. And music was very important to us, but there was no music for us. But in the early 60s, our founder, Ronan, realised that you can circumvent the regulations by just going a little bit outside of British territory and putting a radio station on a ship, hence ships like this. And that was the foundation of Radio Caroline.
This is Radio Caroline on 199, England's first commercial radio station. My name's Simon D, with you for the next 2 hours. First one off the top of the pile, the Hollies, Rockin' Robin.
From somewhere in the Mediterranean, peace, love, and good music. The voice of peace is your voice.
First time that I heard the station, the Voice of Peace, was in the Suez Canal. When I was sailing with my husband, I used to, at that time you had the radio, so I used to go to the channel where they used to I used to listen to the Voice of Peace. And that's how I came to know that there was a radio station called the Voice of Peace. And it's only after I met A.B. did I connect that this was the gentleman and this was his ship. And I think to date, there's nobody who broadcasts better music than A.B. It was really good music.
The idea of a boat broadcasting from the sea was a result of a need, because he couldn't get license here in Israel, or maybe he didn't even try to get a license. But in any case, once you broadcast from the sea, you are a free bird. You can do whatever you want and open a radio station. At those times you needed all kinds of regulations, and from the sea you don't need all those regulations, and therefore he chose to do it from the sea. And he was not the first one and not the last one. By the way, the settlers tried to imitate him and do the same years after him.
There'll always be people who criticize, but we are not here as Israelis, we're here as people. And the goods that we have come from Arabs and Jews at the same time. And I think we should stop this whole business, I think they know who I am already and what the ship stands for and who the crew is.
Peace is the word, and the Voice of Peace is the station, 24 hours a day.
هنا صوت السلام.
When Caroline started in Britain, we just had the BBC. There was no radio competition. And if you were a music producer, you couldn't get your new music played. And that was why Ronan O'Reilly started the radio station, to get new music played on the radio.
I mean, Ronan was not averse to making money. Ronan very much liked making money and using other people's money. But because of his upbringing, his real motivation was to settle the score that he was blocked in doing what he wanted to do. Because you have to remember that his father was an Irish Republican and his grandfather was killed in the 1916 uprising where the Irish rose up against the British occupying Ireland. So there was a rebel streak there, and which is why, of course, he started Caroline at Easter in 1964, because it was Easter 1916 that briefly the rebels took over Dublin and took over the post office and set up gun emplacements and fought the British. So this was his way of saying, I'm evening the score with the British government in a peaceful way.
All his life, I think A.B. was obsessed with what he had done in '48. He had bombed, according to what he said, he had bombed Palestinian villages as a volunteer in the Israeli new Air Force, and the guilt feelings accompanied him for many years and were the motivation to change his way and to start a new start in his life, a new approach. He realized that what he had done was wrong, and this was really the fuel which had fueled his motivation to compensate, to ask for forgiveness for what he had done in '48. I wish more Israelis would have felt the same guilt feelings.
But it's very interesting that despite the fact that he was such a Zionist to begin with, he suddenly, not suddenly, probably in a process, changes and becomes more and more critical. First of all, he does not believe in the Israeli mantra that there is no one there to talk to in the Arab world. He tries individually as a pilot, to fly to Egypt. 3 times he flew to Egypt, but the Egyptians did not take him seriously. They thought he was a clown. And they sent him back immediately after he landed in Ismailia. And twice he landed in Ismailia, and once he came with a flight with Air Egypt from, I think, Larnaca. The Israelis were very cross and angry with these initiatives. This was part of his attempt to bring Egypt and Israel closer. And I think this was the first step in his transformation from a very pious Zionist into someone who was more critical about the Jewish state.
He sat in his hotel and watched the sea and listened to the radios. People were speaking about the conflict and about the war that is about to come. And he felt that there should be a way to speak to people, to warn them about the consequences of war. And he thought it's not possible to broadcast not from the Arab territories and not from Israel, but maybe from the sea, from a ship in the sea, a radio station. And he said, and we'll call it the Voice of Peace, to speak with people and to calm them. He bought a ship with the donation he got from the Dutch people, with their generosity, and took it to New York to transfer this ship to a radio station. It took him almost 5 years to fulfill his dream and to transfer this small ship into a radio station, modern radio station for this period of time. And in May 1973, he came to the Mediterranean Sea and started to broadcasting.
We are the voice of peace.
Well, there's an American saying which goes, you can't beat City Hall. And what that means is, however hard you try, the authorities will eventually win. And our attitude is, well, actually they won't. And if people see that we're surviving, maybe it'll inspire them to survive. Because Ronan O'Reilly, I mean, we all live our lives complying with rules that other people have made. And it's automatic, mostly. Now, we assume the rules are made for our benefit. But then you start to think, well, maybe the rules are made for the benefit of the people making the rules. Now, Ronan had no rules. The only rules he had were his own rules. And when you come up against somebody like that who is determined, it's a very difficult person to stop because he doesn't operate in the conventional way that most of the rest of the population operate.
Yeah, I was a teenager. Well, I was very young. I was about 7 years old when I first started listening to Radio Caroline. But a few years later, when I started working, at the age of 16, 17, Radio Caroline were doing what we call road shows, discos around the United Kingdom, the southeast of the United Kingdom. I actually started going to those, and then got to meet some of the people involved in Radio Caroline, and they knew that I could do engineering, and of course they were looking for engineers, and they were having a problem with a generator and just asked me if I would go out to the ship for a couple of weeks to have a look at it. Well, that was 40 odd years ago, and I'm still doing it.
Radio Caroline North with great music from the 60s through to the 90s.
Caroline started when I was 9 years old, and I grew up with Caroline, and I was smitten by what I'd heard, the fabulous music, the thought that these guys, and they were all guys at the time, there were no women involved at the time, these guys were sitting on a rusty ship and against overwhelming odds just to bring me the latest Beatles song. And it lit a spark. I thought, I want to do that. And that stayed through with me all the way through my teenage years, through my growing years. And then I had the chance to come out. I'd been a fan of the station and came out on visitor trips and was invited out.
From somewhere in the Mediterranean, we are the Voice of Peace on 1540 kilohertz.
And right now you can listen to the Voice of Peace on FM stereo. That's right, 100 on your FM dial.
A.B. felt that if he's going to speak all the time about politics, no one will listen to the Voice of Peace. He understood that it should be a combination of music, of popular music, different styles, with the, in English, very nice and fluent English of British DJs, most of them were British, so that the public will enjoy listening to the radio. But between the songs, there were messages, jingles like no more war, no more bloodshed, peace is the world and the Voice of Peace is this station.
No more war, no more bloodshed.
Peace is the word, and the Voice of Peace is the station.
People who listened, as I did, for many years to this station, were less exposed to the indoctrination that was part of the official Israeli broadcasting stations. So even if you were not exposed to direct political messages, you were also less exposed to the Zionist narrative, so to speak. And you were thinking in a more universal way. So I think in the long run, it had a good impact on people's ability to think out of the box, to look at things not only through the glasses of Zionism or Jewish national ideology. The second impact was, especially towards the last years of the broadcasting, the ship was totally identified with A.B. Natan. So even if the messages were not coming from the ship, people saw the project of the ship and his own more political activity as the same project. And I think that helped to make even a bigger influence in the direction of a more courageous political view vis-a-vis Israeli policies and ideologies.
Well, what happens in throughout the Mediterranean, all the radio stations and the television stations are controlled by governments. With the result, the Arab don't listen to the Israeli radio simply because they feel it must be propaganda since the government controls it. The same effect is on the Israeli side. The difference will be with our station that it will be a permanent dialogue. There are no speeches here. There's no propaganda. There'll always be views from both sides so that people can listen to the other point of view. And by listening to the other point of view, maybe they will understand it.
Radio Caroline, music into the 80s.
It was a bit like a secret society. You had to ask around, because everybody had false names because no one wanted to go to prison. I concocted a name because I didn't want to go to prison for 2 years. But you just had to meet someone who knew someone, and gradually you were accepted and trusted, and Radio Caroline loved people who would help out.
Everybody that came out to Caroline for legal reasons had a different name. It wasn't wise to have your own name just in case you were arrested for playing a Bruce Springsteen record on a rusty ship. So we all had different names, and a friend of mine was Mick Williams. And before I came out to Caroline, he said, "What are you going to call yourself?" And I jokingly said, "Mick Williams." And the time came in this very studio when I went on air at 1 o'clock. And the previous presenter had said, "Coming up next is Mick Williams. I'm Mick Williams." And that name was the name that I used when I first came out to Caroline in the 80s. For years I've been Ray Clark, and I intend continuing as Ray Clark.
How beautiful you are, my ever-smiling light, my ever-shining star. I don't know.
Originally, when I went out to Radio Caroline in the 1970s, I did actually change my name to Stephen Bishop. But when I came back on this ship, the Ross Revenge, I actually came on the air. I was going to use Stephen Bishop, but the guy who was on before me knew me from when I worked on Irish radio in the Irish Republic, and I was called Johnny Lewis then, and he introduced me as Johnny Lewis. So I thought, well, I might as well stick with it now. Everybody knows anyway.
See, the British love a fighter who's fighting with disadvantage, and Radio Caroline was such an organisation. So we got and still have a vast amount of goodwill, because we were the crazy guys who would never give in, even when we were living and working in awful conditions and maybe risking death. Well, in order to play the Rolling Stones. So the Rolling Stones had to be very important for people to do that.
I was here in 1985 when we had what we call Euro Siege, where the government tried to close us down. There was ourselves in a station called Laser 558. We were together, sort of a mile and a half apart, say 2.5 kilometres apart. And the government boat that was trying to close us down moored between the two of us. A couple of times they came close to us to try and be menacing and threatening, but it didn't upset us at all. And in fact, at the time, it was like we were on every news channel throughout the world. Certainly all the European news outlets were covering the story that the government were trying to close us down. Every newspaper in Europe. So it was like us spending £20 million of advertising revenue. So it actually backfired on the government, because suddenly we were getting letters from people saying, "We thought you were gone off the air years ago. We didn't even realise you were still there." So it actually acted in our favour.
On 558 kilohertz, this is Radio Caroline.
This is Mutiny, Mr. Christian. Tony Christian.
Maybe the early years of Caroline were not very professional, but it actually didn't matter, because no one had heard that sort of radio before. So even if they weren't very good, the population absolutely loved it. And in a few months after Caroline started to broadcast, it had a bigger audience than all the BBC networks combined. And of course the attitude of the government as well, somehow we have to stop this. And that's what set off the battle between the government saying, "We will close you down," and Radio Caroline saying, "You will not."
They would try and come close to us in a rubber boat to try and measure how much water and fuel that we had on board. And on a ship, you've got a plimsoll line, so you can normally tell by that plimsoll line how the ship is laying, how much fuel and water's on board. So all we used to do was pump seawater into empty tanks and disperse it around the ship. So every day we sat differently in the water, and in the end they gave up. It was a cat and mouse game, but we used to have a lot of fun with them. Or when they came close to us in a rubber boat a couple of times with measuring equipment to measure our signals, and again they were just trying to be menacing. So on this ship, the Ross Revenge, we have a very powerful fire hydrant, so we can spray water, put fires out. So all we did was, when they came close to us, we warned them what we were going to do. They took no notice, so we just sprayed them with seawater. They soon disappeared, and they never tried that again. It was basically a junior minister in the British government trying to make a name for himself, and it backfired in some respects. Later they got off the air, but Caroline remained on the air, and they just gave up in the end and let us continue. And here we are.
This is a test transmission of the Voice of Peace radio station. The Voice of Peace broadcasts from the motor vessel Peace lying in the eastern Mediterranean.
The Voice of Peace was Abi Natan, and Abi Natan was the Voice of Peace. I mean, there was a lot of music, and he saw that through the music he can get also to the hearts of the people. But by the end of the day, it was his monologues, his interviews. He interviewed people, he did his monologues about peace, and his spirit was on the whole boat. I remember one interview that he did together with me. I think it was with Nabil Shah. When the Palestinians first mentioned the Jericho First idea before Oslo, and this was really a sensation because they never talked about the Jericho First, and he was very proud about it. Later on, it gained some momentum, but above all, it was he tried to reach young people, and he saw that he can reach young people through the music, and this is what he had done.
I don't think anything is going to happen yet, while the politicians are going to keep talking about the problem, and the United Nations and the big powers and the wise men all over the world. I think every day we're having more and more people dying on the borders, and there'll be more bomb throwing, and there'll be continuous retaliation. Actually, what is happening is the politicians will live to talk about these wars, and the ordinary man is going to keep dying.
October War started, and again there was a fight between Israel and the Arab countries. And during the war, Abi took his ship to the port of near the port of Port Said and broadcasted the messages for peace, so people will stop the war and think reasonably and speak with others. But he said it was surrealistic because he could see the missiles and the planes, and the planes are being hit and falling to the sea, and everything was killing the others, but they didn't touch him. They didn't touch the Voice of Peace. After the war, he returned to broadcast again.
Abi, have you got permission from the Egyptians to go through the canal?
Not yet, but I never asked for permission.
They wouldn't let you go through last time. Why would they change their minds now?
I think there's a better climate right now, and I think what we are doing right now is really, they can understand it's a people-to-people effort. It's a gesture of goodwill. It's with flowers. This day long we remembered Yom Kippur as a day of a lot of violence. Maybe we can help change that day by presenting flowers.
Aqaba Port Control, this is Panamanian Vessel Peace, Panamanian Vessel Peace, Papa Echo Alpha Charlie Echo, do you read?
You are not permitted to remain in Jordanian waters, and you have to leave the Jordanian territory immediately. Over.
Okay, we are leaving now. Thank you very much, and good morning.
Caroline could have got involved with politics. In 1970, the station did, but only for a short while. But most of the time, it was here just to play music. The chances are, had the station really got political, had it overstepped the mark, then, as had happened in 1970, it would have been jammed by government, probably any government. And then, you know, if you were an embarrassment to the government, they do their utmost to close you down. Caroline knew how far to go, but didn't overstep that mark. And until the 80s, when the Dutch invaded the ship, they were reasonably safe. We kept ourselves to ourselves and just played the music, and that was the intention.
That's Clive Gregson, an American car, sounding very much like Ralph McTell. 13 minutes away from 8, and we have Colin Blunstone next.
In late summer 1989, a ship came out from England and spoke to this ship and said, "We want you to shut down and switch off and go away. And if you don't, then something else is going to happen which is far more severe than our nice request." And of course, the law of the sea is you can't board a ship in international waters unless you're invited to do so. So our thought was, well, I don't know what they have in mind, but they won't board the ship because international law says you can't do that. But the next day, a very much larger ship arrived and tied up alongside, and it came from Holland. And on board were Dutch police and Dutch coast guards. And in Holland, the Dutch police and coast guards, they wear guns, and there are a lot of them. So they climbed on board, and nobody's going to confront a uniformed man with a gun. And so they took the ship over. Now, my contention is they had no right to do so because they had no authority, because you're only a policeman in the country where that power is awarded to you. The second you are in a foreign country or no country, you're not a policeman anymore, but you are a man with a gun. And they wrecked and stripped every part of this ship during the course of a day and took all of our equipment away and left the ship behind. But the crew were invited to give up and go ashore, and they said, no, we won't, we'll stay. And we started all over again, which is what happened.
And this is the most wonderful moment for me, really, to come back out on a Caroline ship into the studio, play wonderful old vinyl again. This is what radio is all about.
It was a great adventure. Yes, I was aware that I was breaking the law, but I don't make a habit of breaking the law. And if the worst thing I ever do in my life is sit on a rusty ship and play a Beatles record, I haven't got much of a problem with that. My conscience is clear. I wasn't that keen on rough weather. Out at sea, we did have some really, really, really rough weather. But equally, we had flat, calm days, beautiful sunny days. So people pay to go on cruises. We were on a ship playing music, sitting in the sun. When the sun shone, it was lovely. You were with friends, all doing the same thing. They all wanted to be part of Radio Caroline. And let's face it, if you're going to work for a radio station, why not work for one with the most famous name in the world?
We all used to discuss the music that we played. So the great thing with everybody who was on the ship was, if you can imagine a radio station on land, you got somebody come through the door, do the program, go home. Another person comes through the door, do the program, go home. Here, we're doing what we're doing. A record library, you know, we used to sit around and talk about music, you know, what got us into music, when new records used to come out to the ship, and we used to get a lot of new records every week being sent to us, even though the record companies weren't supposed to, but they did because they knew we had the listeners. You know, we actually listened to what the listeners want as well. That was the beauty and the success of Caroline. It was, you know, the listeners controlled us, we controlled the listeners. That's the beauty of the station.
A.B. paid a hell of a price being in jail, and I visited him in jail, not for the radio station, but for his so-called illegal meetings with PLO leaders. Soon after it became, thanks God, legitimate to meet PLO people, but in this stage it was still, Israel was not ready yet, after all the brainwash against the PLO, Israel was not ready yet for such a step.
He understood very early on that peace with Egypt was not the main issue, that the main issue was peace with the Palestinians. And although the voice of peace has not changed because of Sadat's visit, his own personal activity became more focused on the settlements in the occupied territories, the meeting with the PLO, So I think that it was, to his credit, that it was a moment of achievement for him. Not that he contributed directly to this piece, but he understood what many other Israelis did not understand, that this was not the whole picture, that there was still a lot of work to be done.
Well, it's a usual thing with Caroline. When everything's going well, something real bad happens. And when everything seems so terrible that there's no means or possibility of rescuing it, then something good happens. But the worst time was in around 1990, when we absolutely ran out of money. We couldn't broadcast a signal. The ship was in the middle of the ocean. The living conditions were appalling. Nobody should have been expected to live like that. But people did live like that because it meant that some part of Radio Caroline still continued. And then the ship was shipwrecked in a part of the coast where if you get shipwrecked there, you just die. I mean, it's a part of the coast where 250 ships have been shipwrecked and no one has survived, and no ship has survived. And when I heard this was in the process of happening, me having put the people on the ship, encouraged them to be there, I thought, well, this is good. I'm probably going to be responsible for the death of 6 people, with all the repercussions that will follow after that. But astonishingly, and thanks to the British Royal Air Force, there were no deaths, and all the 6 crew were rescued without injury. But then it seemed absolutely certain this ship would just be lost, would break up, would sink. But it was the only ship of 250 which was rescued and brought in to shore. And at that point, we had a ship, but nothing else. So our choice was, okay, you know, we've given it our best shot, let's walk away and get on with our lives. Or, you know, I think we'll start over again. And we did.
Caroline on 199, your all-day music station. It's now exactly 9 o'clock. B-U-L-O-V-A, Bulliver Watch Time. Bulliver. Caroline Continental.
It was a David and Goliath thing. You know, you had Big Brother, the government, trying to stop us all the time. And to be fair, they could have stopped us, but we had a lot of friends within the government, a lot of friends within the police who just turned a blind eye. Because, I mean, since I've been working on shore, and you know, I worked for Legal Radio when I first came ashore, I remember talking to a policeman and he said, we have better things to do than chase DJs up and down the river. You know, we've got criminals to catch. All you lot are doing is playing music, and most of the police and most of the government listen to it anyway. But I think that's what kept us going, the fact that we shouldn't have been there, but we were doing no harm. You know, anybody who worked on the station, if we were doing any harm, we wouldn't have done it. That was it. But we were we were there to entertain, not to do any harm. We brought about a change in radio, in British radio, and again, that was, you know, that was what we were there for, to change British radio. We've done it, but we're still here. You know, we've got a license now, and that's why we're sitting in, you know, if you like, a river, and not in international waters anymore, but still doing it on the ship to say thank you, because there's so many listeners who say Caroline's not Caroline unless it comes from a ship. So for for a weekend every month, we do everything from the ship. After the original Radio Caroline ship sank, the Mi Amigo, I got a call to say, will you come out and work for the Voice of Peace? And I thought, yeah, go on then. So I initially was going to go out there for 3 months, but enjoyed it so much that I stayed for 9 months. And we used to broadcast, from off Tel Aviv, but we broadcast to the whole of the Middle East. So again, we kept everything very short, very sharp, because a lot of people couldn't understand English, could they? You know, so and that was why we kept the links very short and sharp there. But played pop music, because at the time I was there in 1980. At the time, I don't think there was many stations playing, sort of pop music. So, and that was what we used to do.
Well, the BBC doesn't float, so that's the first difference. But you still work with people who are committed to bringing good radio, but it's a different sort of radio to the Caroline radio. Here on the ship, it's part of your life. You live on the ship, you eat on the ship, you sleep on the ship, you are a part of the ship's crew. Whereas with the BBC, you wake up at home, you get in your car, you drive to work, you do the programme, you go home again. And whilst you've got friends there, and the guys there are very friendly and nice guys to work with, as around the world, any radio station, but you don't sleep with them, you don't eat with them, you don't talk with them other than with your programme, because it's then time to go home again. And that's the difference with Caroline. You live, sleep, eat radio.
On the Mi Amigo, which was one of the original Radio Caroline ships, the one that sank in 1980, that was probably the most challenging, because literally every day, it was so old, the ship, we used to spring leaks, so technically the boat was sinking. So every day it'd be like, there's water coming in, pump it out. But it just became like one of those daily occurrences, so you just got used to it. But there was one particular night where, at the time, you think to yourself, yeah, it's windy, it's rough, we're in a situation here where, like we were walking around in the record library on the Mi Amigo, which was downstairs, and the water level was coming up to about here on your legs. So, it was like, do we call a lifeboat? Don't we call a lifeboat? And we thought, no, let's see if we can get the pump started. We got the pump started, pumped the ship out, very cold, but then she started to ride again and it was still taking water, but we were pumping water faster than we were taking it. And we used to fill the holes in the bottom of the ship with a piece of wood, knock them through the holes, so it made it bigger, stop the water, then concrete around them. That was our way of patching up the boat. And I suppose the next day there was myself, a guy called Peter Chicago was our chief engineer, and another guy. We sat at the mess room table, and we actually said that was probably the closest we've ever come to losing our lives. But at the time, you didn't realise it, because there's so much going around in your head, you don't have time to think about it. But even thinking back to it now, you think, that was probably the closest in my life I've nearly come to losing my life.
I just love it. The chances are you heard that for the very first time on this radio station many years ago. The Patti Smith Group and Because the Night here on Caroline. When you turn the radio on and suddenly a radio blasts out of the speaker and you think, wow, I haven't heard this for ages and ages and ages. This is that moment. But the whole attitude has changed over the years. Following on from what Radio Caroline started, it's taken an awful long time. I mean, here we are now with a licence, with a government licence. But why couldn't they have given that to Caroline 50 years ago? It just seems that they were worried about something that really they shouldn't have been worried about. And perhaps that's the way with governments around the world. They worry that they haven't got control, and the government didn't have control of Caroline. But they had nothing to fear, because we only wanted to play music. We weren't spies, we weren't terrorists, we weren't bad guys. We just wanted to sit on a ship and play music. And some politicians still, even today, find that hard to understand.
That's the other thing. It didn't matter how bad the weather got, you never felt unsafe on the ship. Even on the Mi Amigo, you never felt unsafe on the ship. You thought to yourself, because we call it the lady, you say the lady's looking after us, she's looking after us. And again, something we often talk about is in the history of Caroline, which was 1964 to 2019, nobody's been, seriously hurt or even, worse, killed. Yeah, we've had a few injuries, but that's it. And when you consider what we went through to keep a radio station on the air, it's remarkable.
Very good morning to you, sir. Morning, madam. And a special good morning to you, sunshine. It's 6:04 for Tuesday morning, the 10th of June, 1980. Those are the Eagles.
Peace is the word, and the Voice of Peace is the station, 24 hours a day.
It was quite tragic, because the whole project of AB was finally with a very sad end. It's a very sad ending. Personally, his life ended in a very, very sad way, lonely, forgotten, in a wheelchair. Israel didn't appreciate this man as he deserved. And also the ship. It got into financial troubles. Nobody was there to help him. There was Oslo, and everyone thought that there will be peace without A.B. Natan, which was obviously not true. And in a certain stage, he gave up and made the ship sink. There were very few listeners then. It was all dying. And it's a very, very sad story. I mean, it's a good story, it's a good opening and many good years, but the end, both of the boat and of A.B. are both very tragic, very sad, and shouldn't be like this. It should have been different. If Israel would know to appreciate heroes of peace and not only heroes of war, then A.B. would be more remembered and his boat would maybe broadcast until today.
We're going to, also I could not afford to maintain her. You can't work on the ship and also go to violate laws and go to prison. So we lost a lot of money. I lost all the funds I had. I think the ship has done its job, the radio station. The whole purpose was to bring the two parties to sit and talk with each other. And now they started talking, let the government do their work.
I think that by and large, it is a lovely fairy tale with an unhappy ending. A.B. was a dreamer. He was not taken seriously enough as he deserved. People liked his parties. People liked his bon life. He was a bohemian also. Women, food, parties. He owned a restaurant. I mean, he was really a social project. But when it got to politics, and he was even elected for the parliament, he was running for the parliament, but Israel didn't take him seriously enough. And I wish that Israel would have taken him more serious than it take. By the end of the day, it is one of those colorful aspects of the conflict, but unfortunately, it's not a story of success because we know how the boat ended, we know how A.B. ended, both of them forgotten today. And whenever I think about A.B., and I think about him quite often, I must say, whenever I think about him, I feel deep sadness for the fact that not only he deserved more success, but we Israelis and the Palestinians obviously deserved more people like A.B. who really could have changed the picture, but never did. A.B. had many, many friends, and finally he was quite a lonely person. He had those annual big parties in the Hilton every year to commemorate his flight to Egypt, and he had the dinners at home almost every Friday or every second Friday, which I attended, and all the who's who came also there. But as I said, finally he was lonely.
Okay, let's put this as a song. We cannot possibly end without this song. Why don't I hear it? Okay.
We shall
This is a song I think we should all sing. So let's sing, all of you together. And with this, we end the broadcast of The Voice of Peace after more than 21 years of broadcasting. Thank you all for all your support over all the years. Thank you, and shalom to everybody.
I do believe we shall